Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment here of today's show, I want to remind you again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmcpodcast.net. But also, since we are now a live show, as we get a comment from Shep Easy Sweet Spot alluding to my last segment, Caleb's a bit of a project, gonna be a lot of bumps in his road. I agree with you, and that's why I said that this prediction that I was making was very outlandish. But I can see a world where in this game, if they can get the run game going, which was a problem in their game against Tennessee last week, there's definitely a chance for Caleb to not feel so much pressure to create. Because that's where I feel like the NFL is different from college football. In college football, you can improvise so much more. In the NFL, you certainly can improvise, but there has to be some structure to it. In this game, we can definitely see Caleb start to transition there and learn from his mistakes that he made in the Titans game. But I do want to remind you before we get into our second segment about the waiver wire that, as Captain Joking says, huge fan of the show. Thank you so much, Captain Joking. If you are new, welcome to the show. Already a sub. Trade question. Should I trade Adams? I believe he's talking about Devontae Adams and Jordan Mason for Rashee Rice. Let me tell you a story about Rashee Rice. I left him on my bench. Definitely regretted leaving him on my bench. Big game for him. I think he's very effective in this Chiefs offense as that wide receiver one. Proved that he could be a wide receiver one in this Chiefs offense. But then again, you think about all the weapons they have now. Xavier Worthy, even though he only had 3 targets, made the most of them. Marquise Hollywood Brown didn't even play. Travis Kelce still there. Juju maybe. So the Chiefs offense is just so weird in terms of fantasy to kind of diagnose that I just think that at this current point in time, while I love Rashee Rice, I can't see this continuing, where it's a point that you rely on him as a wide receiver one in fantasy. Whereas Devontae Adams, yes, the frustration in that Las Vegas Raiders offense, and Gardner Minshew's not someone who you can see getting him the ball. But Jordan Mason's an interesting piece. We'll talk about him a little bit in this segment. Jordan Mason could add a lot of value in terms of a trade. So I don't necessarily like this whole trade, but say in a couple weeks, if we talk about Jordan Mason a little bit more, where he has a supplementary role to Christian McCaffrey that allows him to get a lot of touches in that San Fran offense, then you can make something. At this current point, I would sit tight a little bit because I like Rashee Rice. I like what he brings. But Jordan Mason is someone who can have a lot of leverage in the future for trades. You can get a lot more for Jordan Mason if you wait just a little bit. So I think that this trade has some interest to it and some weight to it that's very exciting. But at this current point, it's not, a trade that I would make at this moment. But let's get into some waiver wire additions that could potentially help your team as well. Already having Jordan Mason, Captain Joking, is a huge help to you. I wasn't necessarily going to talk about this guy going off this week because I actually thought Christian McCaffrey was going to start this game. Then we got breaking news a couple minutes before the game that he was going to be out. So it's like, that's a big concern for fantasy football fans. But let's see what this San Francisco offense is all about. I had Brock Purdy in my team. I thought this meant that maybe the passing game would open a little bit more. It did not. I lost my first fantasy game because of that. But I was shocked that they had another game plan where Brock Purdy wasn't this distributor in this offense. Jordan Mason really stepped up to the plate. And that's why he's an intriguing asset in terms of whether you still have him on your team or he's still on the waiver wire in your league, because of the leverage he presents. As Shep Easy Sweet Spot says, I'm first in waivers for my league and Baker's available. My QBs are Stroud and Herbert. Is there a better pick than Baker? I think that, yes, you can afford to drop one of your QBs. Perhaps Justin Herbert would be the better option to drop, and you definitely can pick up Baker Mayfield. Baker is a guy who I was going to talk about, but at the end of the day, he's going to be someone who is going to be a week-by-week kind of guy. I love Baker, but he still has that tendency to have a streaky game in him where, he's not up to par. But big win for him against Washington in Liam Cohen's offense. That was the question. How will the loss of Dave Canales affect Baker Mayfield? Because it definitely affected Geno Smith in Seattle a little bit. But he looked sterling in this game. Liam Cohen definitely carrying over a lot of the traits that make Baker Mayfield special in this offense, and I really like how he profiles. Perhaps in deeper leagues he makes a lot of sense, in 2 QB leagues maybe as well, but I wouldn't necessarily call him a starter at this point. He is definitely one of the most contentious fantasy QBs out there, and he still adds a lot of value should you decide to take a swing for him, whether it be through waivers or just by streaming him week by week. But let's get back to Jordan Mason. Let's get back to Captain Joe King's comment, because whether he is on your team, whether you were attuned to him and knew about, Christian McCaffrey's injuries and decided to take a flyer on him and drafted him, or he's still on your waiver wires, Jordan Mason becomes an interesting leverage piece. I talked about this a little bit. Not necessarily a similar situation, but the whole Jonathan Brooks, Chuba Hubbard thing, where you could use Chuba Hubbard early as leverage, where you can draft him and trade him away and promote Jonathan Brooks to your RB1, or you could just keep Chuba Hubbard, and if he plays very well in the Panthers offense, and we saw what happened with that Panthers offense, then, things could happen. But Jordan Mason is definitely an interesting proposition because they didn't even update us on the extent of the Christian McCaffrey injury, so who knows if he will play this weekend against the Minnesota Vikings. Now, I don't necessarily think that he will be as good as, say, a guy like Chuba Hubbard, even though that sounds kind of funny because of the strengths of the 49ers offense, but it was very telling that they really relied upon him in this game, because I did not expect a backup running back to have that much success in this offense. Yeah, it just goes to show a Kyle Shanahan offense is just so versatile in what it can do. So look out for Jordan Mason if he sticks around, and if Kyle Shanahan has plans for him, even if and when Christian McCaffrey comes back. Let's get back to the quarterback situation, because this weekend there were a lot of quarterbacks who had a point to prove. And one of them may not even have been on your radar as a fantasy QB. He's lost his luster as a fantasy QB as he moved from Las Vegas to New Orleans, but maybe something is brewing with this guy. So, even though he has a very tough matchup this weekend against the Cowboys defense, who looked fantastic against the Browns, albeit a Browns team who I'm not expecting much of on offense, Derek Carr certainly looked like an intriguing fantasy option. And when I look at this Saints offense, it's not as bleak as I thought it was going to be. Alvin Kamara still proved that he can provide some level of production. Rashid Shaheed, a very intriguing deep threat for him. And so this Saints offense could sneak up on a lot of people. They could be a sneaky team even in the NFC South, which now looks more wide open because Atlanta does not look as good as people thought they were going to be. And yes, they're still going to be Tampa Bay, but the NFC South with those divisional games, you never know. So see if you can stream Derek Carr. I still don't rely upon him as a competent fantasy QB. But that game, yes, it was against the Panthers, but it did show what the best of the New Orleans Saints offense could look like, and there's certainly pieces there that I'm more confident in. As Tap to Learn says, I can see Shanahan taking the burden off McCaffrey this year. Mason may get a decent slice of that pie, at least early in the season. I could see a world where that's the case, because it definitely looked like it against the New York Jets. You definitely, even if you're Kyle Shanahan, could not have had that much confidence in Jordan Mason going into this game. And yet, that's exactly what the game plan was. I was shocked, guys. I was shocked that was the 49ers game plan, to grind it on the ground with a former undrafted free agent. And yet, Kyle Shanahan is able to do that because he's Kyle Shanahan and because there's so much confidence in this team. No matter who you are, you have the opportunity to step up. And so that's a fantastic point. McCaffrey is definitely someone who, yes, is he a fantastic, fascinating fantasy asset? Absolutely. But he does come with that injury history, so you have to be wary of that. Jordan Mason, whether you're privy to him or not, is someone that you definitely should look out for. But then let's get to the wide receivers. This is where it gets interesting. And let's talk about the play of Alec Pierce. Alec Pierce was someone who was seen as either a wide receiver 3 or as an intriguing outside receiver for the Indianapolis Colts and for Anthony Richardson. But in a similar fashion, not exactly a similar fashion as Xavier Worthy because they had very different games. On 3 catches, he had 125 yards and proved to be a receiver that Anthony Richardson felt like he could trust. Now, Anthony Richardson had one of the most impressive throws I've ever seen in my life, and he's going to continue to develop that arm talent. So the question is, if the Colts feel like they have opportunities downfield, who will be the deep threat? Because remember, A.D. Mitchell is still there. They drafted him, and they have a big expectation for him. And Anthony Richardson did overthrow him on some plays in that game. So Alec Pierce definitely is someone to keep your eye on. Maybe we'll have to wait it out in terms of the waiver wire. I wouldn't immediately go out for him because I want to see more of the Colts, especially Anthony Richardson, if he can sustain that level of downfield passing that we saw glimpses of in that game. But Alec Pierce, man, who would have thought that he would be the Colts' leading receiver? I definitely thought that Michael Pittman would have a better year. Yes, he had some games where he wasn't necessarily profiling as a wide receiver 1, but that was with Minshew, so we'll definitely see. But at the end of the day, it's always good for a rookie, what feels like a rookie quarterback because he didn't have game time last year, but for a second-year quarterback coming off an injury, to have a guy who can rely upon, and most importantly, be a guy you can rely upon because it taps into one of his strengths, which is downfield passing. So Alec Pierce is interesting. Finally, let's talk about Jordan Love before we go to a quick break. Because the situation about surrounding Jordan Love is the Packers believe that his timeline to return will be shorter than expected. But there's definitely QBs on the market. Even Malik Willis that I think could be profiled. Let's talk about Malik Willis. Yes, he had his struggles with the Titans, but the Packers are certainly a team where, he can have decent games. Yes, their schedule's looking rough, but this game against the Colts could be a very exciting game where Malik Willis can perform out of structure. This receiving group, yes, it doesn't have a wide receiver 1, which might make a backup more comfortable to have a security blanket kind of guy, but that's its strength as well. You have so much variety that you can find a solid receiver that you like. So maybe Malik Willis can profile as someone in a deeper league. I'm not saying you should go out and get him immediately, but he could profile as someone who you might be taking a flyer on. And going back to the point of Love, I don't want to say that you should drop him, but I don't necessarily feel confident in the truth of what the Packers are saying. Because MCL sprains, or what happened to Jordan Love, definitely take a little time to wait out. So we're going to have to wait and see with that. But that's all the updates on the waiver wire. Definitely an exciting time early in the season. Don't want to be too premature with your waiver wire pickups. Definitely try and wait it out, but I'm just letting you know. Let me know what you think about my waiver wire kind of updates in the comments, but that will just about do it for this segment. Coming next, I'll give you some early season trade advice, which positions you should be looking at, and which players you could be looking at. We'll be right back after the break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it?